So we're all here. We'll go ahead and get started. So, like I was saying, my name is Dondrub, and this is Buddhism in a nutshell. It's a 4-week course. It's an introductory course. So we'll meet at this time on Thursdays for 3 additional sessions after tonight. And the course doesn't assume that anyone knows anything about Buddhism. It is it's sort of the companion course to Meditation 101, which those are the two introductory courses that FPMT offers. Our center, Tupten Norbu Ling, is an FPMT center, which means that we are a member of an international organization called FPMT, which stands for the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, FPMT. So we are one of over 130 different centers, services, projects all across the world that is part of that umbrella organization. We're based in New Mexico in Santa Fe, physically, but right now we're just offering our classes on Zoom. When we do reopen our physical space, then we'll be offering Zoom classes as well as offering classes in the physical space. And so as an FPMT center, the lineage that we present is Tibetan Buddhism. So as we'll talk about, probably more so maybe toward the end of today and maybe a bit next week, Buddhism, what we call Buddhism, is a global religion now, but it is centered, historically has been centered, and still, in terms of culturally, is centered in Asia, Asian countries, but spread to many different Asian countries. And those countries, when the teachings spread there, they contacted an existing culture, existing ways of thinking and doing. And so the teachings adapted to those cultural influences. And there are also, as I said, as we'll get into a little bit, reasons why some teachings were eventually written down in one language versus another, why maybe, again, due to cultural influences, certain teachings were adopted and other teachings weren't adopted. So there's all kinds of kind of complicated historical reasons why you find different packagings. And I think also a huge part of that is that people are different. And so when the Buddha was alive and teaching in India, he presented a whole range of different teachings that were suited to the dispositions of the people that he was teaching at the time. So you find a variety of different explanations of things and ways of understanding. And as those teachings spread, yet again, people were different and people needed different things from the teachings. And so they kind of got packaged in different ways. But that's to say that Tupten Norbu Ling and the lineage that we present is coming from the Tibetan lineage. Also, as an FPMT center, what FPMT tries to do is present the material particularly for a modern, you could say Western audience. So what FPMT isn't so much trying to do, you do find Tibetan centers that are trying to recreate a cultural experience, maybe in America, but that you might find in Tibet, or you might find, or a Chinese center might try to recreate the kind of shared cultural experience in America that you might find in China. And FPMT isn't really trying to do that. What FPMT is trying to do is present all of the essential teachings of the Buddha, but to do it in a way where that shared cultural understanding isn't necessary, isn't assumed. So again, like I say, really for a Western audience who lacks that shared cultural understanding. Yeah. So as the companion class to Meditation 101, I would say that this class focuses on Buddhist philosophy, and Meditation 101 focuses on what a person needs to be able to start a meditation practice at home. So the two together are, a, a comprehensive but very broad overview of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. We'll do Meditation 101 on Thursdays next month in November, same time, but that's also a 4-week course. That will begin in November. Okay, so that's just a little bit of housekeeping about the course. Any thoughts or questions so far, just in terms of those ideas before we get started?
Not yet.
And also you can find on the event page that you use to get here, where there was that button at the bottom that said join this class, there's a link called materials link, and that has a lot of the materials, as you might expect, that you can use, that I won't necessarily be directly referencing so much, but that's for your benefit. And if in reading that material questions arise, please address those questions as we go along in the course. All right, so tonight, what we're going to start with, what we're going to focus on, for the majority of the first class, is talking about, because when we say Buddhism, the word Buddhism is kind of a newer word in terms of referencing what it means to follow the teachings of the Buddha. That wasn't a word that when the Buddha was alive, people didn't refer to it as Buddhism. Most people, generally, it was called the way. People referred to it as following the way. But now, many hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, kind of a European really way of talking about the collected teachings of the Buddha is Buddhism. So we're going to start with the Buddha, the life of the Buddha. So, and Buddha, as you probably know, you may know, the word itself is a title. It's not the given name of that person. It is a title that's given to someone who's achieved enlightenment. So, and by the end of the class, you'll understand what that means and how it's achieved. But not right now. That's the one, as I've found, doing this course over the years, that's kind of the one thing that's a bit challenging, is that there's so many interconnected parts to Buddhism that we'll introduce a concept, but it takes time to understand the meaning of that concept, so we can't do it all at once. But Buddha means the one who is awake, or the awakened one. And as I said, just kind of as a way of referring to the collected teachings, they are the teachings given by the one who is awake. So awakened to what? Awakened to one's innate potential, is what we can say right now. Awakened to the fullness of what the mind is capable of. Um, and yeah, so that person was born Siddhartha Gautama. And so, not the Buddha. He became known as the Buddha after his enlightenment. Uh, but he was born. So we'll talk about, his birth and his early life and whatnot. So the Buddha was born in a town called Lumbini, which is now in Nepal, in present day Nepal, kind of really near the border between Nepal and India, of course. And this was 2,600 years ago, uh, somewhere in that time frame. So, of course, back then, neither India nor Nepal existed with their current borders and their current name. What that region, the Indo-Nepali region, it was populated with kind of a bunch of small, you could say, city-states, you could say fiefdoms, something of that sort. Um, and so his family, we would, in English, we might say king and queen of a city-state or of a fiefdom, but it's much more provincial than, say, the king and queen of England. There were these much smaller, much more humble city-states. But it is the case that his mother and father were in charge of one of these city-states. And we could say that they were the king and queen. So he was born, therefore, in English, we might say, born as a prince. Um, and his mother, unfortunately, passed away shortly after his birth. So he was raised by his father. And his father was very interested at the time, sort of like the king and queen of England, kind of like it was a very familial process. The title was going to transfer to Siddhartha when his father passed away, and his father was really interested in that happening. And as was, you could say maybe the custom at the time, his father took Siddhartha shortly after his birth to a spiritual seer, and maybe someone known to have clairvoyance. And this person that his father took him to foresaw, so the story goes, that Siddhartha, when he grew up, would follow one of two paths. One path would be that he would succeed in uniting all of these city-states into, and perhaps even larger regions, larger territorial regions, into a unified political dynasty. The other path, the other track that his life could take, was that Siddhartha would succeed in uniting these areas, not in a political dynasty, but in a spiritual dynasty, by spreading teachings, spreading a philosophy that many people would adopt. So his father was given kind of this, prophecy in a way, shortly after Siddhartha was born. And his father, his whole life was about the political dynasty, was about consolidating power, and so on, kind of conquering his neighbors, that sort of thing. And that's what he was hoping for with his son's reign. Um, so that became relevant because the way in which Siddhartha was raised was to be very isolated from understanding the wider society. His father was concerned that um, if Siddhartha experienced suffering, if Siddhartha experienced, if he saw the kind of existential condition that sentient beings were in, then he might seek a spiritual solution. He might look for something beyond the political. So his father kept him kind of isolated on the grounds of their, to whatever degree they had a compound, collection of buildings. It was within that his life, was contained within. However, that plan didn't last forever. It lasted for a while. It lasted for a good while, but eventually, in his late 20s, Siddhartha was able to travel to, he became very curious about the life of the townsfolk. So he was able to travel to the local town and kind of get a sense of things. And when he did that, he came across what are known in the teachings as the four sights. So these were really four different kinds of people that he came across during his travel to the town. So the first was someone who was dealing with extreme old age, someone whose body was quite worn with age, very frail. Their muscles had wasted quite considerably. Up until this point, he most likely had never seen anyone older than his father. And so to see someone who was experiencing, that level of difficulty with their mobility and so on, just due to aging, was kind of a shock to him. Again, because he had been abnormally sheltered during his life. The next person that he came across was someone who was quite ill. This may have been, a leper, someone perhaps with boils, so someone who visibly was very, very abnormally affected by illness. Then he saw an open air funeral procession, which was quite, still even in that region, quite common to parade the dead body through the streets in an open air kind of casket. And he had never, this was his first experience with death. So he brought some servants with him during this travel to the town. And during each of these experiences, he questioned the people that he had brought who lived in the town, who, had a much more normal kind of upbringing. He questioned them about, is there something wrong with this person who's very old? Is there something really strange about this person who's incredibly ill? What is this lifeless, what happened to this lifeless corpse that is in the street? Is that something that is extremely rare, very unusual? And each time he questioned, they all said, well, no, this is natural. This is what all people go through. If you know, unless you die at quite a young age, you will experience the suffering of old age. Unless you die at quite a young age, you will experience various kinds of sicknesses and even perhaps extreme sicknesses. And then, regardless of what kind of life you lead, all lives will end with this corpse that is, you know, being paraded through the streets. And so, of course, in our own lives, we've all had these experiences, but we had them, you know, at quite a young age, and we had them in a probably a supportive, you know, environment, and we were kind of eased into it. But still, of course, we can think in our own lives about the first time that we realized that we ourselves would die, and the first time that we realized that our parents would die and our siblings would die. It's you know, a difficult experience for a young person. Um, you know, even more so, I would think, for someone who's, you know, 28, and experiencing those revelations for the first time because they had been so isolated, you know, previously. So really quite a shock, in, you know, for Siddhartha. And then the fourth site was a spiritual mendicant, a wanderer, which was quite common in India and Nepal at that time. In 2,500 or so years ago, there were many existent religious traditions, and many of them encouraged people to, you know, leave their home, to live a simple, wandering, kind of nomadic life, and to try to seek wisdom, try to seek answers to the, you know, the big questions of life. And he came across one such person uh, in this town. And when he did that, he there was something about that spiritual seeker. And, you know, I think also too, we've all been around holy people, you know, people who, you know, who come from different meditative traditions, who have gained some genuine insight into things. You know, maybe we've seen His Holiness or Thich Nhat Hanh, or, you know, other people, even just on videos. You know, they have a way about them. They carry themselves in a particular way, and this person could have certainly had some of that kind of meditative insight, that kind of transformative experience. Who knows, you know, exactly what, but, you know, to some degree they had some experience that transformed their mind, and it carried through in the way that they were in the world. And Siddhartha recognized something, you know, that there was something about that person. Maybe they were onto something. Maybe they had some answers, because he found it difficult to accept that everyone that he loved was going to experience sickness, aging, and death, and that he was going to experience sickness, aging, and death. At this time, he had a wife, he had a child, you know, so he was recognizing that his wife was going to go through this, that his child was going to go through this. And he found it very painful. So he then became motivated to try to find a solution to sickness, aging, and death. And he suspected, at least at this point, that perhaps a spiritual life would lead to those answers. So he decided at that time to do that, to give up his titles, his land, his authority, and to become this spiritual wanderer. So let me pause here just briefly in case a question has come up or a thought. No? All right. So as I mentioned, his birthplace was in Lumbini. I just wanted to share maybe just a couple of photos. There's a temple in Lumbini called the Maya Devi temple, named after his mother. It's said to be his mother when she gave birth. The story is that she was kind of just walking through a grove of trees, and then the labor started, and she was kind of by herself, so she just sort of gave birth in this grove of trees, by herself. And it's thought that that place is known, and at that place they've erected a temple called the Maya Devi Temple. So this is the outside of the temple that's there now. And this is the inside of the temple. And just another picture of the inside of the temple. And then this is a close-up of what is said to be the paving stone where his mother actually gave birth. It was sort of a lined road that she was on, and this is claimed to be the paving stone. I don't know, but okay. So then, this might be difficult to see. I don't know if you go full screen, maybe you can see it. This represents the travel that the Buddha took from the town of Lumbini to Bodh Gaya after his enlightenment. So we have to backtrack a little bit to then talk about after the Buddha, or I'm sorry, after Siddhartha, not yet the Buddha, after he decided to go forth into homelessness, to become a wandering mendicant. He tried a variety of practices that were common at the time. And, because as I mentioned, there are a variety of existent spiritual traditions in India, in Nepal at the time. And so he studied under great masters of those traditions, of those practices. And what was particularly common culturally at that time were extreme ascetic practices. So people who were trying to transcend the confines of their body to sort of tap into the potential of the mind, they would go long periods without eating. They would stand in cold, running, rivers. They might do some self-mortification, different kinds of ascetic, these sort of more extreme practices. And the Buddha, because that was the tradition at the time, the Buddha engaged in these practices, but ultimately he found that they weren't particularly effective. He found that they didn't really help him do what he needed to do. So, he, as he was studying and practicing, he recognized that he needed to make a change. So I'm sorry, this slide actually is the representation of where he traveled to where he became enlightened. There's a slide after, where he goes to Sarnath, where he gave his first teaching. So I confuse those two in my mind. So this slide, he became enlightened in Bodh Gaya. And this slide is where he traveled from Lumbini to Bodh Gaya, to the place of his enlightenment. And then from Bodh Gaya, he traveled to Sarnath, where he gave his first teaching. That comes a little bit later. So as he was engaging in these ascetic practices, he realized that they didn't really work. And you can find there are statues. They're not in the Tibetan tradition. They're more so like in the Thai style, where they're called the starving Buddha. You find like really emaciated statues, and that represented the period right before his enlightenment, shortly before his enlightenment, because it is said in the teachings that following these ascetic practices, he became close to death, that he starved himself so completely following the discipline, the rigors of the ascetic practices, that he almost died. And you can find starving Buddha statues that represent that period. But again, you generally won't find them in Tibetan temples, and they're generally more like a Thai style of art. But that's what they are referencing. They're actually referencing before he was enlightened, but only shortly before. So what happens then is he is near death, and he's trying to meditate on a riverbank, and there's a musician traveling down the river, and that musician is playing some sort of stringed instrument, and he's hearing the music that this musician is playing as they travel down a raft on the river. And to him, the music is incredibly beautiful. And he has this realization that the musician is only able to produce such beautiful music because the strings of the musician's instrument are tuned kind of right in the middle. They're not, if the strings were too loose, then when you tried to strum them, there'd be no sound. If the strings were extremely tight, when you tried to strum them, you'd get a really harsh, grating sound. But when they're tuned right in the middle, then you're able to produce this really beautiful music. And he had this insight then that he and these ascetic practices had gone too far in one direction, that he had given up too much. He had renounced too much. And he decided then to begin to nourish his body, to eat, to look after himself. And this became one way of understanding what's meant by the middle way, which you may have heard in relation to Buddhism. It isn't the only understanding of middle way, but it's one way of thinking about the Buddha's teachings on the middle way, which is that we do need to think about our obsession with excess, that, if we chase sensory experiences to an excessive degree and we become obsessed with that, and it really takes over as the main driving force, which for a great many people really is an issue, even at the time of the Buddha, and still today, seeking status, seeking wealth, seeking power, seeking comfort. Those can all be taken to an extreme that really is an obstacle, because we just want more and more of those worldly enjoyments, and that really there's no space then to devote time to spiritual practice if that's what we're dealing with. So that's one extreme, but the other extreme is not eating, not sleeping, harming the body because of some false idea that if the body gets punished enough, then the mind will transcend the body just through punishing. So he then decided he needed to follow a more reasonable path. And it was only during this time that he started to be successful. So it was here that he was now in Bodh Gaya. He was now, he had been traveling during this time. It was about 7 years between the day that he decided to go forth and the day that he achieved enlightenment. And during that time, most of that time were these extreme ascetic practices, and he was traveling with companions and so on. But when he changed, when he abandoned the extreme asceticism, he was also abandoned by his companions, because they thought he was wrong. They thought that if they just continued, that they would succeed. But he found that that wasn't the way. So now he finds himself in Bodh Gaya, and this tree here is that's depicted in this picture is said to be a descendant of the tree under which the Buddha, Siddhartha became the Buddha. The Siddhartha achieved his enlightenment. He sat beneath what became known as the Bodhi tree. Bodhi means the mind of awakening, or Bodhi means awakening. So the awakening mind. So the tree under which he achieved enlightenment became known as the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening. And this is not, because again, we're talking 2,600 years ago, it's not the same tree. It's said to be, a sapling of a sapling of a sapling of a sapling of the original tree. So it's a descendant of the original tree, but it is still there in Bodh Gaya in India. He's now, as I mentioned, Lumbini is on the border between India and Nepal. So now he is in what is present day India. Bodh Gaya is in present day India. And there was a tree under which he sat, and the meditation that he engaged in under that tree was the final meditation that led to his enlightenment. So, and there's stories about that period where they say that there's a character, almost in the sutras, in the original sutras, you find a character called Mara, M-A-R-A, that pops up. And Mara is kind of like the troublemaker in the sutras. And sometimes I think it's often a literary device. I think it's often used as a manifestation or representation of internal obstacles. But sometimes, they talk about monks and nuns in the sutras being tempted by Mara. So in a way, it's almost, again, just literarily, it's almost like it takes the role of the devil, or this kind of troublemaker that kind of wants to harm spiritual practitioners. But really, Mara can be understood to be the hatred, the jealousy, the covetousness, the ill will, all of these states of mind that religious practitioners are dealing with and needing to overcome. And in the sutras, you find that embodied, as if it were an actual person, and maybe there is some sort of in a different realm, some sort of troublemaker, who also has it out for spiritual, so I don't know. They talk about like the outer Mara and the inner Mara. So I don't know, but really, um, what we have to deal with are these states of mind that cause suffering for oneself and motivate actions that cause suffering for others. That's really what spiritual practitioners are dealing with and overcoming. But it's said that Mara comes to Siddhartha in his meditation and tries to throw all kinds of obstacles. But we can really also think about that as a psychological process where these where Siddhartha is accessing these really, really deep levels of his own mind, and these sort of primordial energies of attachment and anger and jealousy, they're all kind of bubbling up, and he's kind of having to rid his mind of them. So yeah, but and that's said to have happened in Bodh Gaya under this under an ancestor of the tree that is presently in Bodh Gaya. So let me pause again. Any thoughts or questions? Nope. All right. So now I'll just share again a couple photos. This is present day Bodh Gaya. Of course, all of these things sprung up in veneration of the Buddha's life and teachings. Of course, these monuments and things, are relatively newer. They're still very, very old, but so this is in present day Bodh Gaya, just a couple photos. And here, and again, you may need to go full screen to see that. I don't know. This is what I was saying before, this represents the Buddha's first teaching, where he gave his first teaching. He traveled from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath, and I think there's a pretty large river there. I can only assume that there was a bridge, that he traveled over, but this is, roughly the path that he would have taken from where he achieved enlightenment to where he gave his first teaching at Deer Park in Sarnath. So the first teaching was on the Four Noble Truths. This was his first public discourse, the Four Noble Truths. So really right off the bat with the Four Noble Truths, things get complicated, things get pretty nuanced. And again, this is another one of those situations where we introduce a term and then we won't really fully understand it until we go into more philosophical depth in the later classes. But it's important to accurately define the word noble, even right at the outset, so that it's not misunderstood. Because when we hear the word, and this also gets at something that happens a lot in the English translation of Buddhist terminology, which is that, you have the original Pali, and then you have Sanskrit, and then you have Tibetan, so the Tibetan is translating, generally speaking, Sanskrit, but then, so it's already coming from Sanskrit into Tibetan, and now it's coming from Tibetan into English. Pali is another language, and we'll talk. There's the Pali Canon and there's the Sanskrit Canon. These were the two main languages that Buddhism, the teachings of the Buddha, originally got written down in, and they're so. But the Sanskrit Canon is generally where you find where the corpus of material that traveled to Tibet and is enshrined in the Tibetan tradition. You find the Pali Canon traveling to countries like Burma, the Southeast Asian, Cambodia, Laos, the Southeast Asian countries. Um, but so to get back to my original point, it's difficult to pick English words that carry the meaning that you find that's generally much more nuanced in the Tibetan, informed by the Sanskrit and so on. And so there's a lot of English words that we're kind of stuck using that sound like they mean one thing, because they generally do in English, and they don't really. That's not really the meaning that you would find if you understood the Tibetan, which I don't. But if the actual meaning is much more nuanced, then noble is one of these kinds of words, because we think that this means that the Buddha expressed four ideas that are noble, that kind of have nobility to them, that they're kind of regal, and that's not the meaning at all. Noble is the English word noble is a transliteration of the word Arya, Arya, which is referring to the kind of person who understands that things are true in that way. So the Four Noble Truths are the four things that are known to be true by Arya beings. So it could be, and this is important because we are not. We are ordinary beings, and so we kind of have our own four truths, our own four ways of understanding, but they're different than the ways of understanding that occur when a person transitions from being an ordinary being to being an Arya being. It's kind of like if a person has no understanding of biology, they might look at a system, a biological system, and explain it in kind of a very misunderstood or overly simplistic way. Whereas if a person has a PhD in biology, they would look at that same biological system and they'd be able to pretty accurately explain it. And so that's the difference. It's kind of like going from a state of ignorance to a state of wisdom. And then when you're in that state of wisdom, when you look at the world, you understand it to be characterized by these four statements, these four truths that do not occur to an ordinary being. When an ordinary being like us look at the world, we don't see that these four things are true about the world. So these are four things known to be true by the noble ones, by Arya beings. We can become Arya beings. We just haven't yet. The Buddha, and it's also true, and again, this is a little bit, technical, but an Arya being is also not an enlightened being. A person transitions from an ordinary being to an Arya being, and then from an Arya being into an enlightened being. So it's a stage along the path to full enlightenment, but neither of those states characterize our experience. So we are just referred to as ordinary beings, because we have neither the realizations of an Arya nor of an enlightened being. And again, that terminology will become understood, more clearly, but it's going to take time to unpack the meaning of that. If we wanted to say something about it now, what we would say is that ultimately the purpose of what the Buddha taught is to directly perceive the nature of reality. And we are not doing that. And an Arya being does do that. But an Arya being can only do that in meditation, and an enlightened being is capable of doing that all of the time, even out of meditation. It's the same insight. An Arya being and an enlightened being have the same insight into the nature of reality, but the stability of that insight grows between those two states. It becomes something that pervades their mind so that it appears even out of meditation. Whereas an Arya being perceives it, but only in a very concentrated, deep state of meditative concentration on the nature of reality. Now, of course, we haven't defined the nature of reality, but we'll have to save that for a later class. We will that will become at least somewhat more clear, but it's going to take some time to get to that place. Okay. Again, I'll pause. Any questions?
Thank you. That's no questions.
So now I just have a couple pictures of now Sarnath, or Deer Park, which is the location of the Buddha's first teaching. So just to share, these are, again, some monuments, some temples that were erected to sort of commemorate the fact that this is where the Buddha gave his first teaching. These are all in Sarnath, or Deer Park in Sarnath. Okay, so now we'll talk about the Four Noble Truths. And really, everything that the Buddha taught is a further elaboration or understanding of the Four Noble Truths. The four things that are known to be true by the noble ones. All of his teachings fall under more clearly understanding or elaborating on one of the Four Noble Truths. Okay. So another way of phrasing this, so the Four Noble Truths, as you may know, is the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. It can sound kind of negative, with the word suffering coming up in all four. Here again, though, the word suffering is a translation of the word dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A, dukkha. And dukkha has a much more nuanced meaning than the English word suffering. It's better understood as kind of an unsatisfactoriness. And the idea, the fundamental idea, is that ordinary sentient beings constantly meet with suboptimal circumstances, that everything that we experience is never completely, fully one with contentment, peace, enjoyment, that it's tinged with an underlying current of an unsatisfactoriness. And yeah, so hopefully this will become a little bit more clear over time. Another way of phrasing the four, instead of the truth of suffering, the truth, another way of phrasing that I maybe prefer is to say true suffering, true cause, true cessation, true path. Kind of means the same thing, but I think it gets at it in a little bit more clear of a way. Again, going back to this idea that ordinary sentient beings have their own idea of the four truths. If you were to ask an ordinary sentient being to describe suffering, they would say, well, it's headaches, it's losing your job, it's getting divorced, having your pet die, all of these things that we do experience in daily life, traffic, all of these unpleasant experiences. But that's it. That would be the only answer that you would get from an ordinary sentient being. And then you would say, okay, well, how do you, what's the cause of that? And they would say, well, inconsiderate people, or poorly designed systems, social systems, or they would kind of externalize. They would say, well, it's this person's fault, or it's that system isn't correctly designed, it's not perfect. And then they would say, well, what is the solution? They would say, well, maybe there isn't a solution, or to some things, we can guard against some things through education, or through trying to get ahead, trying to have a cushion of wealth, and, to guard against changes in the circumstances, to have enough money in the bank, and to have a good education, so that you can always get a well-paying job, these things that guard against painful conditions, would be, but they would probably say you can never really fully completely eliminate it. So ordinary sentient beings have their own sort of version of the four truths, but they're importantly different than the ways in which an Arya being understands reality. So that's what we're going to go through now, the Four Noble Truths. So true suffering, for an Arya being, has three subcategories, three different ways in which sentient beings like us experience life. The first of which is the same as an ordinary sentient being's definition of suffering. Again, any overt physical or mental unpleasant circumstance. So, physical injury, loss, anything like that, anything that a person off the street would agree is suffering. That's called the suffering of pain. And that certainly Arya beings agree that all sentient beings, pretty frequently meet with the suffering of pain, even if we just, as we age, even just sitting for too long, our backs start to ache, and we experience the suffering of pain on probably a daily basis. We probably never go a full day without some frustration, some difficulty, something that we wish was otherwise, that we would prefer to be different. So that certainly, and an Arya being might just say, well, I mean, I'm not an Arya being, I don't know what they would say, but I think ordinary beings tend to minimize, that experience. We tend, because it's so pervasive in our experience, we just kind of take it for granted that there is traffic and that there is, all of these unpleasant circumstances. So I think we tend to minimize it, because otherwise, we don't think that there is a real solution, and so we don't perseverate on it. We don't really think, we just sort of accept that it's sort of a baseline part of our life. So coming to terms with how extensive it is, I think is important, but that's really, everyone's in agreement on what it is. And the only issue I would say is, really recognizing that it's really common in our daily lives, which helps us contemplating the first noble truth. The purpose of it is not to be more morbid. The purpose of it is to recognize, that it starts to get better, that, that there is a cause of it and so on. And ultimately we can overcome it. If we couldn't overcome it, there'd be no point in thinking about it, which is why, I think maybe it is encouraged to recognize, to motivate us to recognize how extensive the suffering of pain is. But really the suffering of change is more important to understand. It's more difficult to understand, but also more important to understand, because if you were to ask an ordinary sentient being to define happiness, everything, and if you asked 1,000 and you asked them to list 100 things, so now you have 100,000, you have a list of 100,000 things. Everything on that list that ordinary sentient beings are defining as happiness, an Arya being would say falls under the category of the suffering of change. So that's a much more significant issue, that this disconnect between what we think of as happiness, if it's true, and I'm not suggesting that anyone has to just take anything that I'm saying or that the Buddha is saying as true, but if we just, think of it as a hypothesis, if we just think of it as something that, I'm interested in investigating, I'm interested in proving or disproving, if we take it as a hypothesis, then we're presented with a bigger gulf between these two points of view. And the reason that an Arya being would have that view is that if you were to think about any of those things, people might say going to the beach is happiness. People might say watching, my favorite movie is happiness, or playing with my dog is happiness, or, going to an Airbnb with my loved one is happiness. Whatever all of these things might be, of course, isn't to say that there's just one thing, but the premise is that a lifetime that succeeds in having a lot of the experiences that are on this list is like the point, is like the ultimate, is like, the American dream. The point of why we're here is to have as many of the experiences that are on this list as we possibly can. That's kind of the fundamental assumption that a lot of people have in life, and there's nothing wrong with that assumption, but the Arya beings, the way that the Arya beings are looking at reality, they're saying it just isn't true. And the reason that it's not true is because when we engage in these activities, these external, talking to our best friend, going to a movie, what have you, if we were prevented from switching from one activity to another activity, if we were required to watch our favorite movie and then the doors of the room lock, and the movie starts over again, and we're required to watch our favorite movie again, and then we watch it again, and then it starts over again, and we're forced to watch it a third time, and and so on. Or we go to the beach, and then walls are erected around the beach, and we can't follow that up with going to dinner. We can't follow that up with going to a concert. We're just on the beach, and then the sun sets, sun rises, we're still on the beach. So that's like that's the plot of being stranded on a beach and people are miserable when that happens, when they can't leave and do something else. So the point is that none of these objects that we think of our happiness maintain their allure, maintain their ability to give rise to pleasant feelings in our mind when we can't stop doing them. So the experience itself changes into something unpleasant, into something that we now find to be painful. If we had to eat our favorite meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, every single day for the next 50 years, it wouldn't take more than a few months before we never wanted to eat that. The thing that we most enjoy in the world, we would get nauseous just seeing it on the plate. So if that's, and again, this is just something to investigate. Is this true? If it's not true, then we should reject this concept. But if we investigate it and we find it to be true, then there's something, then there's something there to think more about. So if that's a valid way of thinking about these objects that we enjoy, then we would have to say that they are not in the nature of happiness. Because if they were, then the more than we engaged in them, the happier and happier we would be. And what they're describing, really what they're saying, is that what's happening is we can kind of think about this as a psychological process. So what happens is we start out feeling unhappy about something. We're bored, we're anxious, we're lonely. There's some kind of agitated state in the mind. And then we seek out what can we do about this? What is open to us to fix this sense of agitation, this sense of boredom or anxiety or depression or loneliness, whatever is happening? It's unpleasant and we're motivated to make it stop. So then we think, well, I could call this person, I could watch this thing on television, I could go for a walk outdoors, I could eat ice cream. We have all of these different options. And so then we pick one, and ideally, and so the ideal scenario is that we can actually do that thing, that it's not, if we wanted to go outside, it needs to not be hailing or raining. If we want to eat ice cream, there needs to be ice cream in the fridge. But even if we just assume that we succeed, and many times we don't succeed. Many times, the movie is sold out, or, we're concerned about COVID, or our friend doesn't pick up the phone, or, we're thwarted from doing what we want. But best case scenario, we have this motivating factor of wanting to stop being bored, wanting to stop being lonely, and we can actually do the thing that we think is going to solve that problem. So now we're doing it. And what Buddhism is suggesting is that that agitated state reached a point where it became like critical for us to fix it. And now we've introduced a new stimulus. We've introduced the movie, the food, what have you. And we've distracted ourselves. We feel a sense of relief that in that first moment, we're now doing something new. And that new thing isn't the kind of loneliness or boredom or anxiety that we were previously feeling. So there's a sense of, relief of tension. We feel, and we define that moment of that release as happiness, as what is available to us to experience as kind of the best that there is. But then what happens is that this new stimulus, because it's not in the nature of happiness, at some point, it carries with it its own painful experience. Just like, and that painful experience will become manifest. It starts off extremely small. And the relief that we feel from getting rid of the previous unpleasantness is overwhelming that small agitation that is present in the new stimulus. But if we continue to experience that new stimulus and we're not successful in switching to a different stimulus, then that agitation will begin to grow. And it will at some point serve as the impetus to then do something else. That's why we don't wake up and go to the opera and spend 16 hours at the opera and then go back to sleep and then wake up and spend another 16 hours. That, we want to do this, and then we want to do this, and then we want to do this. And we try to fill the 16 hours with 8 different or 12 different things as best we can. And we think that that is kind of the best that we can do, that's what happiness is, and that's what's open to us. But the Buddha, and even here just arhats, Arya beings, have a very different view. They would say that real happiness is a state of mind that we have to cultivate, that can exist independent of experience, independent of what we're engaged with. So it can pervade any experience, but it has to be cultivated. But that's a little bit different point. But yeah, so that I think it's a really important thing to think about in terms of, because it's the thing, it's the category of activity that almost everyone is spending their life in service of. And it blocks having the time and the space to cultivate, inner conditions that are more beneficial. So that's the suffering of change. And then there's what's called all-pervasive suffering. And this gets at the idea, an important concept in Buddhism, which we'll get at, is the idea of rebirth, which is that the body and mind are of different continua, and the mind pre-exists this particular form, and that body and mind became associated for us in the womb, and that association is, has continued to last because we're still alive. But at some point, our physical body will no longer be able to host consciousness. It will fail to the point where it can no longer serve as a host for consciousness. And then we call that death, and body and mind separate. But then mind takes a different form. Mind associates with a different form. And that's an important concept in Buddhism, and Buddhism would say that sentient beings are experiencing a cycle of birth and death that is beginningless and endless. Ordinary sentient beings are. And that changes when enlightenment is achieved. But for an ordinary sentient being, this process of birth and death is always characterized by the first two types of suffering, the suffering of pain and the suffering of change. So what that essentially means is that we can't just die and under normal circumstances just expect to take some other experience that's not characterized by the suffering of pain or the suffering of change. Unfortunately, no matter what we experience, it will be characterized by those two types of suffering. That's called all-pervasive suffering, that every kind of experience that's open to an ordinary sentient being is conditioned by the suffering of pain and the suffering of change. I promise it gets more hopeful as we go through the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is a real bummer, but then, the purpose of it is that it can be overcome, and that the Buddha overcame it, and he presented a path for overcoming it. Any questions at this point?
The word acceptance came up for me. And that if there's acceptance, isn't that somehow going to help?
Well, so in terms of kind of in a practical way, in a conventional way, Buddhism does encourage us to recognize that there are things that are outside of our control, like traffic, or like people with bad disposition, negative people who are short-tempered, or and so there are things. Buddhism certainly encourages us to recognize that the only thing that we have any access to is our own mind, and that going through life thinking that there is a way of getting rid of suffering by hoping that other people are different, or hoping that we just won't experience traffic or loss, or that kind of acceptance is a really useful way of reducing the overt suffering that we would otherwise experience if we go through life thinking that everyone should be polite to us, or that we should never be inconvenienced, or that our loved one should never die. We might not say those things out loud, but we kind of do live our lives expecting that is, because we find ourselves surprised every time that we are inconvenienced, every time. And, it's kind of like, well, how dare this happen? So that is, in terms of changing that view, that is a really important way of reducing the painful experiences that we would otherwise have when those views are in full force. But it's also true that Buddhism has even subtler and more effective ways, because this life will come to an end. And that technique, although it has an important role to play, we'll take another life after this, and then we'll take another life after that. So Buddhism really is also about cutting off that whole process, and just recognizing that we have to be more realistic about our expectations and so on. That doesn't accomplish that goal. So it's a really important part of how to reduce our suffering, but it won't complete, it's not the whole picture.
Thank you.
Okay. So now we'll talk about true causation. So again, things even now are starting to get a little bit better, because, one way of thinking about the Four Noble Truths is like a medical disease model, in a way, where we have to, if we're not feeling well, if we have headaches all the time, or our stomach is upset consistently, we have to recognize that that's true. We can't just be in denial. We all hear stories about people who, they had this or that symptom, but they just sort of discounted it. And then it was too late. Like they had a heart attack, or they recognized, they had inoperable cancer because they didn't confront it. They just ignored it. So the first noble truth is like that, is like recognizing that there's a problem here, that there is unsatisfactoriness that's categorizing or characterizing my experience. And I need to actually be motivated to get rid of it and not just accept it as something that I can't do anything about. And you would want your doctor to also agree with you that there's a problem too. Like if you go to the doctor, you wouldn't want them to say, you're just making it up. You would want them to take it seriously and really agree with you that there's a problem. Otherwise, there's no hope of fixing it. And then the second noble truth is where you would want your doctor to also be able to say, this is what's wrong with you. Not just, oh, I agree that there is something really wrong, but it's called this. It's not this, it is this. You don't have cancer, you do have, some sort of ulcer. Because if they don't know what it is, then they don't know how to treat it. They don't know what to do, because the treatment for cancer is different from the treatment for an ulcer. So you would need your doctor to be able to pinpoint why you are experiencing suffering in order to have any hope of it getting better. So with true causation, now we're pinpointing why all of the truth of suffering, or true suffering, is even occurring, which is really important, because if it were causeless, then we would be stuck with it. If it was just like, well, that's the way things are and we don't know why, we'd be stuck with it. But the Buddha is saying that here, this list are the 3 root delusions, the 3 root poisons. And these are mental states that give rise to suffering. And these are defined as anger, attachment, and fundamental ignorance. And really, we can think of, although the list is there's just a list of 3, we can say that fundamental ignorance gives rise to anger and attachment. Fundamental ignorance is something that, again, unfortunately, we have to put a pin in and talk in more detail about later. But it is a state that arises with the mind. It's not one with the mind, but it arises with the mind. And because it arises with the mind, it's completely normal. It's part of nature. It's not anything, we're not cursed. We're not, there's no one that did it to us. It's just a condition that arises with ordinary mind, but it causes sentient beings to misunderstand how things exist. And when they misunderstand how things exist, they tend to exaggerate the process of observing reality. But we observe some parts of reality, and we observe them to have pleasant aspects. We observe other parts of reality, and we observe them to have unpleasant aspects. And we think that those pleasant or unpleasant aspects are there in what we're observing. And they're not. They're part of the mind. They're projected onto the object. And we're mistaken about how that process unfolds. And because we're mistaken about it, we think we have to possess pleasant objects in order to be happy, and we have to push away unpleasant objects in order to be happy. And we're mistaken about that too. But we go through our whole lives trying to bring in and push out objects. And objects doesn't mean inanimate. It could be people, could be circumstances, just means something that can be cognized, something that can be observed by mind. So it could be a person, could be a job, what have you. And this gives rise to all of the reasons why. It gives rise to the process of rebirth. It gives rise to our grasping at objects, and all of the things that we experience are caused by fundamental ignorance. So there are secondary and tertiary and all sorts of other states of mind that are also problematic, but anger, attachment, and fundamental ignorance are at the root of why suffering arises. And again, this is just something that we'll have to unpack slowly over time. And I'm just kind of trying to rush a bit because we're running out of time for today. So then true cessation is where we get even more hopeful. Not only have we confronted that there is suffering, and not only have we explained what the cause of it is, but now our doctor, you can say, is saying, this is treatable. Yes, you are sick. Yes, it is an ulcer. And here is, and I know that ulcers like this are completely removable. I know that that's true. The Buddha is saying that attachment, anger, and fundamental ignorance are removable from the mind, that they are currently manifesting, they're currently part of our experience, but they don't have to be. We can remove them from the mind. There are two types of true cessation. There's nirvana and enlightenment. These are both cessations that the Buddha validly taught, but they apply to different kinds of Buddhist practitioners. The goal of Buddhist practice in largely the Southeast Asian tradition is nirvana. We could say, if we wanted to be a little bit technical, we could say lower nirvana. That is the stated goal and the achievable goal, and a valid goal that the Buddha taught, that took root in mainly the Southeast Asian Buddhist countries. Again, like Cambodia, Thailand, the Southeast Asian Buddhist countries. The Northern Asian Buddhist countries, like India, Tibet, China, Japan, the stated goal of their practice is full enlightenment. And this is something that we'll go into in more detail, but there are differences between these two paths, but they're both paths taught by the Buddha for practitioners of different dispositions. For some practitioners, nirvana is a more realistic goal, based on their views and their beliefs and their interests, and for other practitioners, enlightenment is a better goal to give them, to teach them. So they were both paths taught by the Buddha, and they're both true cessations. Either way, they both overcome fundamental ignorance and all of the branch kind of states of mind that come after it. Okay. So then you also need the actual medication, or the actual surgery, or the actual, the remedial steps that you're going to take that will, so this is the true path that leads to the cessation of suffering. And that true path is comprised of three parts. There's a critical ethical foundation. So we have to understand what actions and what states of mind cause harm to oneself and motivate actions that cause harm to others. And we have to learn how to navigate that and to subdue those, so we have to stop killing, stop lying, we have to do things that stop harming others in order to create the fertile kind of ground in the mind for the higher realizations. Then we have to train in meditative concentration. Meditative concentration is kind of an unavoidable part of Buddhist training and the Buddhist path. We'll talk more about that, but without becoming a really expert meditator, not, maybe not necessarily in this life, but, laying the foundation for it. And then, over time, we sort of pick those propensities back up in future lives. The seeds that we plant in the mind, they remain in the mind, and we kind of can stay on that kind of trajectory. Eventually, we have to become a really expert, incredible meditator to give rise to the meditative realizations that will help us to overcome these negative mental states. And this gives rise to wisdom, the wisdom that understands the nature of reality, the wisdom that sees that we are mistaken about how things exist, and transforms into a mind that does directly understand the nature of reality. So we'll leave it there for today, but I will address any, as best I can, questions, thoughts and questions that have come up.
There's plenty to contemplate. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about, but yeah, it was a lot of different. I know a little bit about Buddhism, but you brought a lot more to light. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so again, so we'll meet 3 more times, and we'll just we'll pick back up, and yeah. And again, there's materials on the website, on the event page for today, that you can begin to look at and review over the next week. All right, well, thanks for coming, and I look forward to continuing next week.
Thank you.
Have a good night.